You've spent months, maybe years, perfecting your retirement budget. You've stress tested the withdrawal rates. You've modeled for inflation. You've run a dozen Monte Carlo simulations, and you've added a comfortable buffer just in case. You trust that final number implicitly. It's the logical foundation of your entire plan. But what if I told you that 4 years of my own post-retirement data prove that the most rigorous budget, the kind built by engineers and analysts, has a structural blind spot? It's not a rounding error or a faulty assumption in your spreadsheet. It's a black hole that reliably absorbs a significant, predictable amount of cash every single year after you stop working. It's a category of spending so fundamental that it's practically invisible until the day you actually need it, and by then, your model is already failing. If you're anything like I was in my late 40s and early 50s, you have a spreadsheet that is your pride and joy. It's a fortress of logic built to protect you from uncertainty. You've run the numbers a dozen different ways, and they all confirm the plan is sound. And yet, there's a voice in the back of your head late at night when the house is quiet that asks a very specific question. What did you forget? This isn't the generic fear of a market crash or a health crisis. You've already modeled for those. It's the engineer's cold dread of an unknown variable, a critical factor you haven't even thought to include in the equation yet. It's the nagging suspicion of a bug in your financial code. I lived with that exact feeling for the last 2 years of my career. For 24 years as a software engineer in Austin, my entire job was to find the single point of failure in a complex system before it took everything down with it. It was about hunting for the subtle memory leak, not waiting for the catastrophic crash. When I retired at 54, I applied the exact same logic to my own financial code. From day one, I started tracking every single dollar, not because I was afraid of running out of money, but because I was methodically hunting for that single point of failure in my own beautifully constructed plan. I had 3 different spreadsheets that confirmed my plan was perfect. Turns out, reality doesn't use Excel. I've been running that real-world diagnostic for 4 full years now. Today, I'm not here to give you advice. I'm here to share the bug report. In a moment, I'm going to walk you through my 4-year data debrief. We're going to look at the initial hypothesis from my pre-retirement model and see how it performed against real-world data. I'll show you exactly when the first anomaly appeared, how a tiny memory leak in the budget evolved into a significant drain, and I will reveal the one number that represents the cost of building a post-career identity, a systematically overlooked expense I call identity capital. By the end of this analysis, you will have a concrete variable to replace that vague anxiety and a data-backed framework to incorporate this invisible number into your own financial plan. If that quiet question, "What did you forget?" has ever kept you up at night, then you're in the right place. Subscribe and stick around because we're about to find the answer. My initial hypothesis was simple: to validate my pre-retirement model against the unforgiving reality of cash flow. For a plan to have any integrity, it needs a validation mechanism. Otherwise, it's not a plan. It's just a guess dressed up in a spreadsheet. So from the very first day of retirement, I began tracking everything. The setup was meticulous, treating my personal finances like a production system under observation. The baseline was my final pre-retirement budget, a detailed document that projected my expenses with what I thought was surgical precision. I had line items for property taxes in Travis County, projections for health insurance premiums, and even an inflation-adjusted buffer for gas prices. The central goal wasn't just to stay on budget, it was to stress test the model itself and confirm that my financial code was as robust as I believed it to be. The first 12 months of data seemed to confirm my genius. At the end of year 1, I ran the numbers, and the results were almost boringly predictable. My total spending was within 4% of my initial projection. The model was holding up. The budget felt less like a forecast and more like a script that reality was following. For a brief period, I felt a sense of calm, the deep satisfaction of an engineer whose system is performing exactly as designed. It's a dangerous feeling. This false positive, this early confirmation is a trap for the analytical mind. It can lull you into a state of complacency, making you believe your assumptions are facts when they have simply not been tested by time. The data wasn't wrong, but it was telling a story that was dangerously incomplete. Short-term validation can often be the most misleading data you will ever see. The first clue that something was off didn't appear on a spreadsheet. It was a feeling that surfaced late on a Sunday night, about 18 months in. I was in my home office here in Austin, the only light coming from the blue glow of my monitor, the only sound the hum of the computer, and the faint buzz of cicadas outside the window. This was my quarterly budget review, a ritual I found more comforting than stressful. I was sipping a glass of iced tea, watching the condensation make a ring on the desk, when I noticed it. The miscellaneous hobby category was running consistently over budget. It wasn't a catastrophic failure, but a steady quarterly increase. My immediate gut reaction was a spike of fear, but not about money. It was a fear of indiscipline. Was I getting sloppy? Was this the beginning of the infamous budget creep that sinks so many plans? That fear of personal failure is what forced me to dig deeper. I wasn't going to let 2 decades of financial discipline get derailed by impulse buys. I started breaking down the miscellaneous spending, expecting to find a trail of careless purchases, random Amazon orders, or too many expensive coffees. But that's not what I found. The list of expenses was deliberate, almost methodical. A new set of Japanese chisels for the garage workshop I was slowly building. A 6-month online course in digital fabrication and 3D printing. The annual dues for a local makerspace. And a surprising number of components for a custom home server I was designing. The tension inside me shifted instantly. It wasn't a fear of indiscipline anymore. It was a startling realization. This wasn't a leak in the boat. This was the cost of building a new one. I wasn't spending money because I was bored. I was investing in the very infrastructure of my new life. This is where the engineering mindset kicked back in. The anomaly, once identified, needed a formal diagnosis. In my old job, we had a term for this, a memory leak. It's not a dramatic system crash that grabs everyone's attention. It's a slow, steady, almost invisible drain on resources that the initial system diagnostics completely miss. It doesn't corrupt the data, but it gradually degrades performance until the entire system becomes unstable. My meticulously planned budget was suffering from a classic memory leak. It wasn't one large, unexpected expense that was throwing off the numbers. It was a whole new category of spending that was growing steadily over time, a fundamental requirement that my initial model, for all its detail and precision, was completely blind to. My pre-retirement budget was a perfect plan for a life I was no longer living. The name for this hidden expense became clear the moment I stopped thinking about it as a hobby and started seeing it for what it was, an investment. I called it identity capital. This isn't just money for pastimes. It's the capital required to build a new life structure, to fund the projects, skills, and social networks that must replace the purpose, engagement, and intellectual challenge that your career once provided for free. On my spreadsheet, hobbies was a $100 line item. But building a functional woodworking shop in my garage to replace 40 hours a week of structured, complex problem solving wasn't a hobby. It turned out to be a multi-$1,000 capital investment in my own sanity and sense of purpose. You spend 40 years building a professional identity. You're naive if you think you can replace it for free. The resolution to this discovery was a quiet moment of profound clarity. In that same late night session, I went back into my master spreadsheet. I deleted the miscellaneous/hobby line item, which had become a source of constant low-grade anxiety. In its place, I created a new category, identity capital. I then went back and recategorized every single one of those expenses, the chisels, the course, the makerspace dues, the server parts, moving them all under this new heading. I leaned back in my chair looking at the screen. The numbers hadn't changed, but the story they told was entirely different. It was no longer a story of budget failure, but a story of necessary investment. That new line item was the most important number on the screen because it represented reality. A retirement plan isn't a fixed blueprint you build from. It's a piece of software you ship and then have to keep patching. So what was the actual number? Over 4 years, the amount I invested in identity capital averaged out to just over $8,100 per year that I had not planned for. That single overlooked category represented a 12% distortion in my annual budget. It was a systemic error equivalent to my entire property tax bill or my food budget for the year. And my model, the one I had stress tested and refined for years, had completely missed it. This wasn't a rounding error, it was a structural flaw. When I first saw that number, that 12% delta, my stomach dropped a little. It was a significant variable I had failed to account for. Let me know in the comments, what was your first gut reaction to hearing that number? Is this category of identity capital something you've already considered? Or is it a new and slightly terrifying variable for you too? The reason this category is so systematically overlooked is that it's an unvested need. You simply cannot accurately price the cost of replacing your professional identity while you're still employed. Your job provides a default structure, a built-in social network, a clear set of problems to solve, and a title that defines a huge part of who you are. These things have immense value, but they don't show up on your W-2. The need for a replacement only vests on the day you walk out the door for the last time. It's a liability that doesn't appear on your personal balance sheet until after you retire, and by then you're trying to fund it with a plan that never knew it existed. It isn't a personal failure of planning. It's a systemic feature of the transition itself. Your model is blind to it because you, the modeler, are not yet living in the environment the model is for. The final adjustment then isn't just about increasing your budget. It's about reframing it. I now have a permanent line item for identity capital, and I fund it as seriously as I fund my health care or housing costs. My recommendation is to treat this like a business plan. Before you retire, identify 2 or 3 deep engagement activities you plan to pursue. Not just travel more, but something that requires skill building and investment. Price out the real startup costs. Want to get serious about photography? That's not a camera. It's lenses, software, workshops, and travel to interesting locations. Want to build a consultancy? That's web hosting, insurance, and professional development. Treating it like this transforms a vague fear into a concrete financial problem you can solve. The most important number in my retirement wasn't my net worth. It was the cost of building a life worth living with it. The process I just walked you through, from the initial false confirmation to the eventual diagnosis, reveals a fundamental truth about long-term financial planning. The small, persistent overruns in my hobby budget were not isolated incidents of lax discipline. They were data points signaling a systemic failure in the model itself. The memory leak in my financial code wasn't a bug. It was a feature of a life transition I had failed to price in. The Japanese chisels, the 3D printing course, the makerspace dues. These were not frivolous expenses. They were the building blocks of a new structure for my time and intellect. Seeing them all together, recategorized as a single unified investment, transformed the narrative from one of budget creep into one of deliberate, essential construction. It was the data finally telling the correct story once I learned how to label it properly. I remember the exact moment this all clicked into place. And it wasn't a moment of panic. It was a moment of profound, quiet relief. It was nearly 1 a.m. on a Sunday. My home office in Austin silent, except for the low hum of the very home server I was over budget on. The rest of the house was dark. Outside, the summer cicadas were buzzing, a sound so constant you forget it's there until it stops. I was looking at the spreadsheet, at this list of expenses that had been a source of low-grade anxiety, and I suddenly didn't feel the sting of failure anymore. I felt the calm of a correct diagnosis. The condensation from my glass of iced tea had made a perfect ring on the wood of my desk. I wasn't looking at a financial leak. I was looking at the foundation of my next 20 years. And for the first time, I could see its real cost. This is the turning point where the analytical mind must give way to a larger perspective. Your retirement plan, no matter how rigorously you build it, is not a predictive model of the future. It is a historical document. It is a perfect plan for a life you are no longer living. Every assumption, every line item, is based on the needs, habits, and identity of your working self. But the person who shows up on day one of retirement is a different user, with a completely new set of requirements that were invisible just the day before. The single biggest flaw in our planning is that we design the vessel for a passenger who no longer exists the moment the journey begins. Your spreadsheet doesn't have a blind spot. It has an expiration date, and that date is your last day of work. Therefore, the work isn't to build a more perfect, more detailed, more complex spreadsheet before you retire. The work is to give yourself permission to become the editor of that plan after you ship it. This isn't a license for reckless spending, it's a mandate for honest accounting. You are not failing your budget when you invest in the skills, tools, and communities that will replace the structure of your career. You are funding the most critical line item of all. So, when you find yourself spending money on a new pursuit, don't ask, "Is this in the budget?" Ask a better question. Is this a necessary investment in my identity capital? If the answer is yes, then your job isn't to feel guilty about the expense. Your job is to go back to the spreadsheet, create the line item, and give that investment the legitimacy it deserves. Now that we've put a proper analytical framework around this concept, the real work begins for you. I've personally found my own financial plan is exponentially more robust, not to mention more exciting, now that it officially accounts for the cost of building a life, not just funding a static existence. It transforms the budget from a defensive document, a fortress against the unknown, into a proactive one, a blueprint for intentional engagement. So, if you're comfortable sharing with the rest of us who are running our own numbers, I'm genuinely curious to read your thoughts. What's one identity capital investment you now believe you'll need to make for yourself when you retire? Let's build a public database of these ideas right here in the comments. If you find this kind of data-driven debrief genuinely useful for your own planning, subscribe and hit the bell. I've got 4 years of numbers, and we've only just begun to scratch the surface of what they reveal. Your spreadsheet is not the territory. Go get the data.